that are there, and so prices start going up and up and up, and we have this phenomenon of inflation, which is the appearance of rising prices. I emphasize the word appearance because in reality prices do not rise. What's really happening is that the value of the dollar is going down. If we had a money which was based on gold or silver or anything else that had intrinsic tangible value that they couldn't just create out of nothing, you would find that prices would remain stable over a long period of time. And to illustrate that point, it's interesting to know that if we had lived in ancient Rome, we would have been able, with a 1-ounce gold coin, to buy a very fine toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. Well, today, what can we buy with a 1-ounce gold coin? We can go into any men's store and buy a very fine suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The real price of those items hasn't changed in thousands of years when expressed in terms of real money. But when expressed in terms of those paper things we carry around, Federal Reserve notes, we call them dollars, they're not. They're Federal Reserve notes. They buy less and less and less because there are more and more and more of them being pushed into the economic pot of soup. We're still not done with the analysis. So we lost some purchasing power. Where did it go? Did anybody get it? People don't ask the question, did somebody get my lost purchasing power? It's as though, well, it just evaporated. It went up into heaven or someplace. It's just gone. No. For every loser, there's a winner. Somebody got your lost purchasing power. Who? Let's track it. Those people who got the lost purchasing power were the ones who were right at the point where the new money was injected into the pot, because they got their hands on it first, and at that point it had full value. But by the time they spent it and gave it to the next person, and then they spent it, and it started moving out toward the edge of the pot where most of us are, then it lost its value. But the ones up at the nozzle were the ones that had gained on our lost purchasing power. Who are they? Well, it's clear that the government is number one, isn't it? Because that first check, that billion-dollar check that we tracked, went to the government, number one. They got it first. Of course, then those who work for the government got it next, and the contractors who have government contracts got it next, and so forth. But the government was number one in line. What about the money created on the banking side of the partnership? Who got that first? Well, the borrowers, didn't they? The ones that lined up at that window. That was the nozzle. Now, this is something that we all recognize. In times of inflation, everybody says it's wise to borrow. Why? Because you borrow dollars, but you pay back in dimes. Inflation erodes that thing. You have contracts, and you pay back with money that has less and less value. So the poor guy that gets your payment at the end of the line has lost his purchasing power, but you gained it because you were smart enough to borrow in times of inflation. That's the way it works. That's one of the reasons they entice people into debt, because it's the smart thing to do. What they don't tell you, however, is that what you are gaining from this process, you are turning around and having to pay to the bank in the form of interest payments on that loan. Interest on nothing. The bank is actually capturing your gain through interest payments. Now, sometimes you have paper profits. Oh, look at the value of this real estate. Look at the value of this stock. People are paying more and more for it. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that economic conditions can change, and these paper assets can contract as well as expand. And when the economy does contract, as usually it does, always does, then people are wiped out. They don't realize that The boom-bust cycles that we have had since the creation of this Federal Reserve mechanism is like a sawtooth. The economy expands slowly for long periods of time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and people think this is going to go on forever. And then, boom, it comes down, usually very quickly. A lot of people lose their assets. And then it starts again for another 20 or 30 or 40 years. Oh, it's a wonderful ride, and then, boom, it comes down. And every time it comes down, people lose their investments. Notice, however, when you go to the bank and they give you something which costs them nothing to create, what do they want from you in return? Signature on the dotted line for your car, your house, all your assets, right? So if you can't make your payments of this nothing money, they get your marbles. They always win. In times of whether it's expansion or contraction, it doesn't make any difference. It was planned that way, carefully worked out. These people are scientists, ladies and gentlemen. So there you have it. This is the bottom line, that those who gain your lost purchasing power are the two groups, are you surprised? The two groups that comprise the partnership in the Federal Reserve System, the government and the banking cartel. They're the ones that get your lost purchasing power. Now, this process is a tax. I don't care what you call it, inflation, or what name you want to give to it, it is a tax. You have no control over it. It's taken from you regardless. There are no exemptions. There are no deductions. Everybody's involved. It's the most direct tax of all, far worse than the income tax or the excise tax. You cannot escape it. In fact, it falls most heavily on those who can least afford to pay it. That's why I call it the most unfair tax. The Federal Reserve System is the originator of the most unfair tax there is, because it falls on those who are on fixed incomes, those who are retired people. Anybody who has saved anything, has been frugal, is paying this tax more heavily than those who are borrowing. Discourages thrift, doesn't it? If there's anything you remember about this presentation this evening, I hope it is this, that inflation is a tax. This is why these two groups are in the partnership. On the government side, they are able to tax their citizens in any amount, unlimited amounts of money, without the people even knowing that they are, in fact, paying a tax. And on the banking side, they're able to collect perpetual interest on nothing. Well, let's go back to Jekyll Island. We have a lot to learn on that island back in those days, because all of what's happening today was germinated right there around that table for 9 days. They had a particular problem, which was what to call this creature. You see, this partnership between government and banks was not new with the Federal Reserve System. It actually was conceived in Europe in the 16th century. And it was experimented and then finally perfected with the formation of the Bank of England in 1694. From that date forward, all of the governments of Europe had used this kind of a mechanism. Of course, they didn't call it the Mandrake mechanism like I do. They have another name for it, and that is a central bank. That's the official name for this type of thing. If you want to look it up in a textbook, in the index, or in an encyclopedia, you'll find it under central bank. So, when it came time to bring the central bank mechanism to America, these fellows on Jekyll Island knew that's what they were doing, but they couldn't call it a central bank because Congress was already on record as saying they didn't want that. I don't think those fellows knew what a central bank was, but they'd heard the phrase, and they knew that's what they had in Europe. And they didn't want that here, because they thought that what we needed in this country was something that was unique for the American economy. So the word central bank was out, and these men debated what to call it, and this was their strategy. They said, first, let's call it federal, to make it sound like it's a government operation. Next, let's add the word reserve, to make it seem like there are reserves somewhere. Next, let's add the word system. This was far more important than it seems today, because remember, the primary concern was this concentration of power in New York. So they had to convince the American people that they were creating a system of banks, not just one bank, but a system spread over the geography of the whole country. First they were going to have 10, then they said, no, that's not enough. We need 12 regional banks to diffuse this power, or the appearance of diffusing it. They're going to build these big bank buildings so the local yokels could come and look and say, golly, we got one of them here. You know? It's not all back in New York anymore. So the concept of system was very important. Well, we realize today that what we got was not federal at all. There are no reserves anywhere. There's not a system in the sense of diffusion of power, and the Federal Reserve banks aren't even banks. So in all four words, we have appearances of the fourth kind. It was brilliant deception, and now the next step was to sell it to the public. The first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was called the Aldrich Bill because it was sponsored by Senator Aldrich, and Paul Warburg warned him against that. He said, Nelson, if you put your name on this bill, it's going to be voted down in Congress because you're so clearly identified with big business interests. They're going to say that's the bill of the big bankers. And apparently Aldrich's ego was so big, he must have said something like, well, no, I'm well respected in the Senate. After all, I am the chairman of the National Monetary Commission, and for whatever thing, I suppose he wanted to go down in history as being the creator of the Federal Reserve System. So he put his name on it, and Warburg was right. Congress put thumbs down on it. The bill of the big bankers. Well, it was a minor setback. They took their bill, they scrambled the paragraphs around a little bit, took Aldrich's name off of it, and found a couple of Democrats to sponsor the bill. Now this was different, because everybody knew that the Republicans represented big business. But they also knew that the Democrats, on the other hand, represented the common man. You know, the working man, the fellow on the assembly line, like Ted Kennedy. So they found a couple of millionaire Democrats to sponsor the bill. Carter Glass in the House and Senator Robert Owen, who was himself a very successful banker, sponsored the bill, and now it was the Glass-Owen bill. Next, Aldrich and Vanderlip began to give speeches and interviews to newspaper reporters condemning the bill that they had written. They said, this bill will ruin the banks. It'll be terrible for the nation. And of course, by the time that got into the newspapers and the average person read that, they were saying, golly, the big bankers don't like this bill very much. It must be pretty good. You know, you have to give these fellows credit. They weren't stupid. They didn't get to be where they were by being country bumpkins. They understood mass psychology, they understood politics, and they played their cards exceedingly well. Meanwhile, these same individuals were, out of their own pockets, financing so-called grassroots study clubs that were springing up all over the country, holding public meetings, printing and distributing pamphlets extolling the virtues of the Federal Reserve Act. They gave huge amounts of money to some of our better-known universities in America, established new departments of economics, hand-picked their own people to be the professors to chair those departments. And then those professors began to give speeches and write scholarly essays about how wonderful the Federal Reserve System was. Then, at the insistence of Paul Warburg, they added a few excellent provisions to the bill. When I say excellent, I mean provisions which seriously restricted the ability of the Federal Reserve System to create money out of nothing. And Warburg's associates said to him, "Paul, what are you doing? We don't want that in our bill." And his reply was classic. He said, "Relax, fellas, don't you get it? Our object is to get the bill passed. We can fix it up later." It was because of those provisions that they won over the support at long last of William Jennings Bryan, who was the head of the populist movement. He had opposed this bill from the beginning. But when he saw those excellent provisions in there, he said, "Oh, well, I guess now I can support this bill." And with his collapse of opposition, the road was now clear. And everybody was for, almost everyone, except a few lone voices, was for the Federal Reserve. And indeed, they did fix it up later. Since the Federal Reserve Bill was passed, it has been amended over 100 times. And every one of those excellent provisions were long ago removed, and many more have been added, which greatly expanded the power and reach of the Federal Reserve System. And so, with this professional, brilliant strategy and deception, it is no surprise that eventually the public and Congress was solidly for the Federal Reserve System. And the bill was passed on December 22nd, 1913, and the creature from Jekyll Island finally moved into Washington, D.C. I'd like to focus for a moment on what are the objectives of the Federal Reserve System, because, you know, we're told that the purpose of the Fed is to stabilize the economy and to put an end to chaotic banking. One of the more popular textbooks used in our colleges and junior colleges today is a textbook on economics written by Paul Samuelson. And here's what he says. He says the Federal Reserve sprang from the panic of 1907 with its alarming epidemic of bank failures. The country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking. Well, that's what he said, and that's what the students are learning. Let's not challenge that for the moment. Let's just take it at face value, because this is the official doctrine, isn't it? The purpose of the Fed is to stabilize the economy and to protect the people. That's why they're raising our interest rates right now. That's what Greenspan says. Why is he doing this? To help people, right? To stabilize the economy so we won't have massive inflation. It's for you folks that he's doing this. See? That's what he says. Put the lid on inflation. And if you're trying to figure it out on the basis of these official pronouncements, you'll never get it. Let's just take this official pronouncement at face value for a moment and see how well it's doing. Let's give it a report card. Since the Federal Reserve was created, it has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 29 through 39, recessions in the years 53, 57, 69, 75, and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 87. We all know that corporate debt is soaring, personal debt is greater than ever. Both business and personal bankruptcies are at an all-time high. Banks and savings and loan associations have failed in larger numbers than ever before. Interest on the national debt is consuming half of our tax dollars. Heavy industry has all been but replaced by overseas competitors. We're facing an international trade deficit for the first time in our history. 75% of downtown Los Angeles and other metropolitan areas is now owned by foreigners, and over half of the nation now officially is in a state of recession. Now, that's the report card of the Federal Reserve System after 80 years of stabilizing our economy. I don't think it's even controversial to say that it has failed to meet its stated objectives. The only controversial issue is, why has it failed? And my answer is, because those have never been its true objectives. What are its true objectives? Well, what are the objectives of any cartel? To enhance the profit margins of the members of the cartel and to stabilize their position in the market. If we hold that in mind, now we get a different picture folding before us. Now they're not failing at all, they're succeeding. In particular, there were three objectives that the bankers had, the ones on Jekyll Island. They had three objectives in 1910 through 1913 that they wanted the Federal Reserve System to accomplish for them, and they were very verbose on the topic. And here they are. They said first, they wanted to stop the erosion of their power away from New York. That's right. Exactly the opposite of what the Federal Reserve System was supposed to accomplish. That's what they wanted. They were concerned because as the nation was expanding westward into the south, new banks were springing up along the frontier, and every year a little more percentage of the capital was moving away from the East Coast. Well, they still had the lion's share, but they knew that they had to put a stop to that trend now while they still could. This is a good point to mention that when we talk about the cartel, I'm not talking about the small banks that are struggling for survival under the Federal Reserve System. Remember, John D. Rockefeller said competition is a sin. And one of the purposes of the cartel was to put a check on the competition from these new banks, keep them in their place, eliminate them if possible, and to do so through regulation, setting up conditions that the big banks could afford to handle, but the small banks could not handle. So I'm not talking about your local banker now. I'm talking about the New York cartel. That was objective number one. Objective number two was to reverse the trend of what they call private capital formation. Now that's banker language for a trend in which individuals or businesses use their own savings for something instead of going to the bank and borrowing money for it. At the turn of the century, there was a trend toward private capital formation in business particularly. Businesses were holding back a certain portion of their dividends each quarter, putting that money into a sinking fund, and then as the capital formed, or as they saved more and more money, then they used their own savings to build a new factory or to launch a research and development project or whatever. And the banks were extremely concerned over this trend. They wanted to entice businesses back into the banks to borrow money. And they knew that the only way to do that is to lower interest rates. And you may say, well, why didn't they just lower interest rates? Because you're thinking in terms of today, not then. Today, it's easy if you're the Federal Reserve System to lower interest rates because they have the lever to move it either way, up or down, totally within their control. But in 1913, there was no lever because the money in those days was backed by gold and silver. And you can't hook a lever onto that kind of money. Under those conditions, interest rates are the result of the natural forces of supply and demand. People cannot control it. I mean, individuals or committees cannot control it. Millions of people interacting in freedom control it, supply and demand. But it's not subject to political control. And they knew that the only way that they could get people into the banks is to artificially depress the natural interest rate. How do you do that? They said that the answer was through a flexible currency. They said what the nation needed was a flexible currency to meet the demands of industry. Well, what is a flexible currency? It's not this stuff that bends. You need a dictionary to understand some of these things. A flexible currency, ladies and gentlemen, is money made out of nothing. That's what that means. Now, you see, the trick is not too complicated. If you can create money out of nothing, you don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on it to show a profit. So, with a flexible currency, they could lower the interest rates below the natural level, still make plenty of profit on it, and entice the businessmen back into the banks. So the goal was a flexible currency. That was objective number 2, and objective number 3 was to pass on the inevitable losses of the banks, pass them on to the taxpayers in the name of protecting the people. Now, those are the true objectives of the Federal Reserve. Let's now issue another report card and see how well it did. Did it keep control with the larger banks in New York? And the answer is yes. We have big banks in the West and in the South, but they are nothing compared to these mega banks in New York, which stride the world with offices in Peking and Moscow and Africa, everywhere. The big banks continue to dominate. A few years ago, a book appeared called Secrets of the Temple, written by William Grider, published by Simon & Schuster, and it was a bestseller. It was advertised as a scathing attack against the Federal Reserve System. Well, I could hardly believe my ears. Couldn't believe it. A scathing attack against the Federal Reserve System, published by Simon & Schuster? One of the biggies? How could this be? I thought maybe something's happened that I didn't know about. I don't even have to finish writing my own book. They did it. See? So I ran down, got a copy of the book, and read it. And I was amazed at 2 points. First of all, I was amazed that Grider had excellent history in the book. I thought it would be a whitewash, and it wasn't. His history was excellent. I knew about a lot of it because I was right then in the middle of researching it. And on this point of the concentration of power in New York after the Federal Reserve, I'd like to read what Grider said. He's talking about 1913 here. He said, "At the time, the conventional wisdom in Congress was that the government institution would finally harness the money trust, disarm its powers, and establish broad democratic control over money and credit. The results were nearly the opposite. The money reforms enacted in 1913, in fact, helped to preserve the status quo, to stabilize the old order. Money center bankers would not only gain dominance over the new central bank, but would also enjoy new insulation against instability and their own decline. Once the Fed was in operation, the steady diffusion of financial power halted. Wall Street maintained its dominant position and even enhanced it." End quote. Which is true. That was the objective of the cartel. The other thing that amazed me was Grider's conclusion. What are we going to do about this? He proved conclusively that the Federal Reserve had always acted against the public interest. He proved that it was designed to do that from the very beginning. So what do you suppose his solution was? To abolish the Fed? No, nothing that extreme. Well, how about a major overhaul? Oh, no, not necessary. What then? His solution was, he said, you see, it's all so complicated. We've made a lot of mistakes, but we're learning as we go. Relax, everybody. It's under control. All we need now are wiser men. You see, that's the kind of powder puff criticism, or powder puff solution, I should say, that it takes to be published by Simon & Schuster or any of the other major publishing houses which are firmly interlocked in the financial web on Wall Street. This is controlled opposition, ladies and gentlemen. It's something we need to understand. It makes no difference how accurate you are in your history. It makes no difference how much you point with alarm to what's going on, or how you condemn, how you rant, and how you rave. If you don't have a solution, a realistic solution, if your solution is just relax, all we need now are wiser men, or if your solution is just vote Republican, then you don't have a solution. This isn't a question of Republican versus Democrat. The Federal Reserve has been furthered by Republicans more than Democrats over the years, if you have to cut the line. This is controlled opposition. We have to be on our guard for false leadership. Well, anyway, I'm off the topic. Getting back.
Karma.